On their first anniversary, Millionaire husband pushed his wife from the cliff thinking she couldn't swim. But what happened next? James Carrington had a smile that could open doors and close deals. It was the kind of smile people trusted, envied, and feared all at once. And tonight, at his glittering engagement party, it was plastered across his face like armor. The room buzzed with laughter, clinking glasses, and the subtle murmur of admiration directed his way. But James wasn't basking in the glow of it all, he was enduring it. Across the room, his fiancée Grace laughed softly with an older couple. She had that kind of presence that put people at ease, a quiet elegance that made her seem almost out of place amidst the opulence of the Carrington world. Her simple pearl necklace and the understated shimmer of her dress stood in stark contrast to the jeweled guests surrounding her. James's gaze lingered on her for a moment too long, his jaw tightening. She was too naive, too trusting. But that was the point, wasn't it? That's why his father had chosen her. Grace Bennett, Robert Carrington had declared with an air of finality on his deathbed. She'll be good for you, James, the kind of good you desperately need. James had scoffed at the time, but Robert wasn't in the mood for argument. His father, ever the self-made visionary, had a way of turning commands into requests. Grace was the daughter of an old acquaintance, a woman whose father had once helped Robert when the Carrington Empire was still a dream. To Robert, Grace wasn't just a debt repaid, she was a chance to anchor his wayward son to something pure and meaningful. James had rolled his eyes at the idea. Grace wasn't the type of woman he usually went for, too soft, too sweet. But when his father's will tied a generous slice of influence and wealth to the marriage, James suddenly saw the appeal. He'd marry her, put on the act, and be done with it. The wedding was nothing short of a spectacle. Grace, for her part, floated through the day with a quiet joy. Her parents wept during the vows, and her maid of honor couldn't stop gushing about how Grace had finally found her fairy tale ending. James had played the part perfectly, holding her hand just tightly enough for the cameras, brushing a kiss across her cheek at all the right moments. But later, as the champagne flutes emptied and the guests departed, Grace noticed the first crack in his polished veneer. "You did well today," he said, his voice flat as he pulled at his cufflinks. "You smiled in all the right places. That's all anyone cares about, you know." Grace blinked, unsure if he was joking. She smiled anyway, brushing the comment aside. The first few months passed in a flurry of social events and business dinners. Grace tried her best to adjust to this new life of luxury, even if it felt suffocating at times. She made an effort, decorating their home with thoughtful touches, suggesting quiet evenings together, even learning to navigate the intricate dance of society with its unspoken rules and veiled barbs. James, however, remained distant. He was attentive in public but cold and dismissive behind closed doors. One evening after a dinner party, Grace finally asked, "James, are you happy?" He looked at her as if she'd asked the most ridiculous question in the world. Happy? Happiness doesn't matter in this world, Grace. Results do. Her heart sank, but she didn't press further. She told herself he was just stressed, that he'd soften with time. It wasn't long before James's disdain began to show in sharper ways. At one gala, Grace had inadvertently interrupted him while he was recounting a story to an influential investor. She corrected a minor detail, just an innocent mistake, but the flicker of irritation in his eyes was unmistakable. Later that night, his voice was as cold as the marble floors. "Don't ever contradict me like that again," he said, "not in front of people." Grace blinked, stammering, I didn't mean to. I was just trying to—" "Don't try," he snapped. "Just let me handle it." The words stung, but she nodded, swallowing her pride. But James's cold demeanor wasn't always constant. Occasionally he would soften, offering glimpses of the man she had once hoped he could be. These rare moments were like lifeboats in a sea of indifference, and Grace clung to them, hoping they signaled a change. That hope flickered again one evening as they sat in the dim glow of their living room. James surprised her by reaching across the table, placing his hand over hers. "We should get away," he said, his voice softer than usual. "Just the two of us for our anniversary." Grace's heart lifted. Was this it? Was he finally opening up? She nodded eagerly. "That sounds wonderful, James." He smiled and poured her a glass of wine, toasting to their upcoming trip. But as he turned away, the shadow of his true intentions flickered across his face. The trip James planned was a remote cliffside estate perched over the crashing waves, a private chef, and views that seemed to stretch to the ends of the earth. It was the kind of getaway most women would dream of, and for Grace, it felt like a glimmer of hope. "It's beautiful, James," Grace said softly as they pulled up to the sprawling property. The sea breeze caught her hair as she stepped out of the car, her eyes wide with wonder. James flashed her one of his perfect smiles, the kind that had charmed half of Manhattan's elite. "Only the best for my wife." His tone was warm, but his eyes were cold, calculating. The first evening was filled with champagne, candlelit dinners, and easy conversation. Grace was hesitant at first, but as the wine flowed and the tension seemed to melt away, she began to believe this trip might be the turning point their marriage needed. "You're full of surprises," she said, smiling as James handed her a glass of wine. "I almost didn't believe you when you suggested this trip." "Well," he said, sitting across from her, "I've been distant. I thought it was time to make up for that." Grace's heart lifted. For the first time in months, he seemed present, attentive, even kind. The next evening, after another luxurious dinner, James suggested a walk along the cliffs. The moon hung low in the sky, its light casting silvery ripples across the waves below. "Come on," James said, holding out his hand. "You'll love the view from up there." Grace hesitated for a moment. The wind was stronger now, the kind that whipped at your clothes and made you feel like the earth itself was breathing. But James's hand was steady, his smile reassuring, and so she took it. They walked in silence, the sound of the waves crashing against the rocks below, filling the air. Grace shivered slightly, pulling her cardigan tighter around her shoulders. "It's breathtaking, isn't it?" James said, stopping at the edge of the cliff. "It is," Grace agreed, her voice soft. She stepped closer to the edge, gazing down at the churning sea, a little terrifying, too. James stood just behind her, his hands in his pockets. He tilted his head, studying her like she was a chess piece on a board. "You trust me, don't you, Grace?" he asked suddenly, his tone casual but laced with something darker. Grace turned to look at him, her brow furrowed in confusion. "Of course, James, why would you ask that?" He smiled, a slow, deliberate smile, just making sure. And then he pushed her. Grace didn't scream at first. The shock of the push stole the air from her lungs as she plummeted toward the waves. The world blurred into a whirlwind of wind, water, and terror. When she hit the ocean, the impact was like 1,000 knives slicing into her. The cold was unbearable, stealing what little breath she had left. For a moment, she sank, the weight of her soaked clothes pulling her down. But then instinct kicked in. Kicking and clawing, she broke through the surface, gasping for air. The waves battered her relentlessly, tossing her against jagged rocks. James stood at the edge of the cliff, peering down into the darkness. The waves crashed violently, swallowing any sound that might have escaped Grace's lips. "She's gone," he murmured to himself. Finally, he turned away, brushing imaginary dust off his hands as he made his way back to the estate. He rehearsed his story in his head, a tragic accident, a romantic walk gone wrong. He'd play the grieving husband perfectly, and no one would ever suspect the truth. But what he didn't know, the story was far from being over. Grace's body was broken, her arm hanging at an awkward angle, her ribs searing with pain every time she breathed. But she was alive, somehow. She clung to a jagged outcrop of stone, her fingers raw and bleeding, the salt stinging her wounds. The sky above had begun to lighten, a hazy dawn creeping over the cliffs, but it offered little warmth. Every muscle screamed for her to let go, to slip back into the waves and let current carry her away. And then she heard it, the low hum of a motorboat cutting through the morning fog. "Damn," a voice muttered, rough and gravelly, but with a note of concern. The boat slowed, and when a man leaned over the edge, his eyes narrowing as he spotted her crumpled form on the rocks. He tossed out a rope, his movements swift and precise. "Hold on, girl," he said. "I've got you." Grace didn't have the strength to respond. She barely felt it as he hauled her into the boat and wrapped her in a coarse blanket. All she could do was shiver and gasp as the boat lurched toward a distant shore. Back at his home, Elias laid her down gently on a threadbare sofa, muttering to himself as he examined her injuries. Her arm was fractured, her ribs bruised, and her skin was streaked with cuts and scrapes. To Grace, the home felt like a place untouched by time. The walls were lined with faded nautical charts and rusted tools, a far cry from the gleaming marble and polished glass of her life with James, but it was warm. And it was safe. "You've been through hell," he said, tying off a makeshift splint around her arm with practiced ease. Grace didn't respond, too weak to do more than let out a shaky breath. By the time she woke again, hours had passed. The room was dim, the fire casting flickering shadows across the walls. Elias sat nearby, his eyes fixed on the flames. "You're lucky to be alive," he said, without looking at her. Grace blinked, her voice rasping as she forced out the words, He pushed me. Elias turned slowly, his brow furrowing as he studied her. Who? My husband, she whispered, her voice trembling. For a moment, Elias said nothing. Then he exhaled sharply, leaning back in his chair. Well, looks like you've got a second chance. Question is, what are you going to do with it? Grace lay awake that night in the dim warmth of Elias's cottage, her thoughts churning like the relentless waves outside. The betrayal felt like a physical wound, raw and pulsing, impossible to ignore. She kept replaying the moment on the cliff, the coldness in James's voice, the calculated look in his eyes before he pushed her. She had loved him, trusted him. How had she been so blind? As the hours dragged on, her despair began to shift. The grief hardened layer by layer like molten metal cooling into steel. She didn't just feel betrayed, she felt furious. James hadn't just tried to kill her, he had stolen something far deeper. Her trust, her peace, her very sense of self. They'll worry, she admitted one evening, her voice breaking as she stared into the fire. My parents, my sister, they'll think I'm gone? Elias tossed another log onto the flames, his expression grim. Good. Grace turned to him, startled. How can you say that? Because if they think you're gone, so does he, Elias replied. And as long as he thinks you're dead, you've got time to figure out how to hit back. You go running to your family now, and you're as good as handing him a second chance to finish the job. The truth of his words settled heavily on her chest. As much as it hurt to think of her family mourning her, she knew Elias was right. If James knew she had survived, he wouldn't stop until she was gone for good. I don't have a choice, she said. If I tell anyone, it's over. The first step to staying hidden was shedding the woman she used to be. He handed her a pair of scissors, nodding toward the cracked mirror in the corner of the room. Grace stared at her reflection for a long moment, the familiar image of her long, wavy hair and soft features staring back at her. This was the woman James had married, the woman he had controlled, manipulated, and discarded. She picked up the scissors. The first snip felt like a release, and by the time she was done, her hair was a short, uneven crop that barely reached her chin. Elias helped her dye it darker, the glossy chestnut replaced with an inky black that made her look almost unrecognizable. She swapped her designer clothes for simple jeans and oversized sweaters, the kind of clothes that let her blend into the quiet anonymity of the fishing village. When she looked at herself again in the mirror, she hardly recognized the woman staring back. Good, she thought. That woman was gone. While Grace lay low, James thrived in the limelight. He cried on cue during interviews, clutching Grace's wedding photo as he spoke about their perfect love and the tragedy that had taken her life. I can still hear her laugh, he said, his voice breaking just enough to seem genuine. She was my everything. Headlines called him the heartbroken billionaire. Charities begged him to attend their galas, while the media painted him as the epitome of strength and grace in the face of unimaginable loss. But behind closed doors, James wasn't grieving. He was pacing, fuming. Grace's body hadn't been recovered, and that loose end gnawed at him like an itch he couldn't scratch. Unable to shake his unease, James decided to take matters into his own hands. He arrived in the nearby fishing village, his polished shoes crunching on the gravel roads as he approached anyone who would talk to him. Have you seen this woman? He asked, holding up Grace's photo. She's my wife. She fell from the cliffs. Most people shook their heads, intimidated by his presence and his sharp, too perfect smile. When he approached Elias, the old fisherman was sitting on a bench near the docks, carving a piece of driftwood. You seen this woman? Elias barely glanced at the photo. Can't say I have, his tone even. James's eyes narrowed. You sure? The ocean has a way of, carrying things. Elias met his gaze steadily. I've been here a long time, mister. Seen a lot of things wash up, but no sign of her. James lingered for a moment, searching for cracks in Elias's calm demeanor, but there were none. Finally, he turned and walked away, his frustration simmering just beneath the surface. When Elias returned to the cottage that evening and told Grace about James's visit, her chest tightened. He's looking for me, she said, her voice shaking. He's not sure you're alive, Elias corrected, and you're going to keep it that way. Let him think the sea did his dirty work. It'll make what comes next a hell of a lot easier. Grace couldn't shake the image of him standing in the village, his sharp eyes scanning every face, his polished charm a thin veneer over the predator lurking beneath. He would stop at nothing to finish what he'd started, and Grace knew she couldn't afford to hide forever. She needed a plan. As she mulled over her options, one name kept surfacing in her mind, Harold Carrington, James's family lawyer. The very idea made her uneasy. Harold wasn't just any lawyer. He was deeply embedded in the Carrington empire, privy to its secrets and intricacies. But there was more to him than that. Grace had seen it herself. Harold wasn't like the others who orbited James. He had a quiet integrity about him, a calm, steady presence that set him apart. Most importantly, Harold had been Robert Carrington's man. Grace remembered how James's father had spoken of Harold with trust and admiration, calling him the moral compass of the Carrington dynasty. James, on the other hand, had always seemed uneasy around Harold, dismissing him as too traditional or out of touch. That tension had stuck with her, even when she didn't fully understand its significance. Harold wasn't loyal to James. He was loyal to the values Robert had stood for, and Grace suspected that Harold's loyalty didn't extend to covering for James's darker deeds. "I can't call his office. I can't show up in broad daylight. I need to find a way to make contact without drawing attention," Grace said. Elias raised an eyebrow. "So what's your plan then? Send him a carrier pigeon?" Grace ignored the jab, her mind already racing. During the few times they had spoken at Carrington estate functions, Harold had been kind to her, almost protective in his quiet, observant way, and she had noticed something else about him. Harold often visited a private library on the edge of the city, a quiet, tucked-away place where he preferred to work in peace, far from the chaos of Carrington headquarters. Grace remembered him mentioning it once during a dinner party, his voice laced with pride as he described the library as his sanctuary. It was her way in. The first step was finding out if Harold still frequented the library. Grace couldn't risk walking into the building herself, not when someone might recognize her. Instead, she sent Elias into town with specific instructions. The following afternoon, Elias returned with confirmation. "Saw him walk in there myself," he said, setting a small stack of books on the table. "Same guy you described. Slim, gray hair, nice suit. He's got a spot on the second floor near the window. Looks like he's there a couple of afternoons a week." Relief washed over Grace, but it was quickly followed by a wave of nerves. The next part of the plan would be trickier. She couldn't just walk up to him and explain everything. She needed to be sure he'd hear her out before he panicked, or worse, alerted James. "I need to leave him a message, something only he would understand, something he can't ignore." Grace wrote the message by hand, her letters steady despite the trembling in her fingers. "The truth, like the tide, can't be held back forever. Harold, I need your help. Meet me at the cafe across from the library tomorrow at 3 p.m. Come alone. A friend." Harold had quoted Robert Carrington's favorite saying, a phrase Grace had never forgotten because of how much it resonated with her. She folded the note and tucked it into an envelope, leaving it unsigned. "If he sees that quote, he'll know it's not random," she told Elias. "How do you know he won't just toss it?" "He won't. It's too specific. He'll know it's about the Carringtons, and he'll be curious enough to come." Elias offered to deliver the note, slipping it into Harold's briefcase while he was absorbed in his work at the library. Harold never noticed him. By the time he left the library that evening, the envelope was waiting for him, nestled among his papers. Grace spent the next day pacing the length of the cottage, unable to sit still. What if he didn't come? What if he did come and brought someone else? The uncertainty gnawed at her, but she reminded herself that Harold wasn't James. He was careful, thoughtful, and if her instincts about him were right, he wouldn't ignore a plea for help, especially one tied to Robert Carrington's legacy. When Harold walked into the cafe the next day, Grace almost didn't recognize him. His normally sharp suit seemed wrinkled, his hair slightly out of place, and there was a tension in his shoulders she hadn't noticed before. He scanned the room, his brow furrowing as he looked for the source of the mysterious note. Grace sat at a corner table, her hair cropped short and dyed black, her oversized coat and scarf making her look more like a local than the polished woman Harold would remember. She watched his hesitation, the way he glanced toward the door as though weighing whether to stay. Then their eyes met. Harold froze. Grace stood slowly, her movements careful and deliberate. She pulled down the scarf covering her neck and face, revealing the scar on her temple from the fall. Harold's jaw dropped. He stepped closer, his voice low and filled with disbelief. "My God, Grace?" "Yes, I'm alive." He sank into the chair across from her, his hand gripping the edge of the table as though he needed something solid to hold on to. You're supposed to be dead. The accident," James said. "It wasn't an accident," Grace interrupted. She leaned forward, lowering her voice so no one could overhear. "James tried to kill me, Harold. He pushed me off the cliffs." The words hung between them, heavy and undeniable. "You can't stay here," his voice hushed. "If James knows you're alive—" "I know," Grace said. "That's why I need your your help. I can't go to the police. Not yet. James has too many resources. He will bury the truth before it even reaches them. Harold's brow furrowed. What exactly are you asking me to do? Grace met his gaze, her voice resolute. Help me expose him. Help me take him down. For a long moment, Harold said nothing. Then he exhaled slowly, leaning back in his chair. Expose him how? A story like this can't go public without proof. The media may love a scandal, but they'll demand evidence. And even if we find some, James has lawyers, PR teams, and half the media in his pocket. It won't be easy. That's why we go for the cracks first, Grace said. James isn't perfect. He's careful, yes, but careful people make mistakes when they think they're untouchable. We find his mistakes. You've worked with the Carringtons for years. There must be something in the records, something he's hiding. Harold tilted his head, his sharp mind clearly turning over the possibilities. The financial records would be the best place to start. James has always been reckless, especially since his father died. I can access the older records through the firm, but for anything current, I'll help, Grace interrupted. I know where he hides things. I lived in that house for a year. I heard things, names, accounts, conversations. I wasn't just some accessory to parade around, Harold. I paid attention. Harold studied her for a moment, the lines around his mouth softening. All right, he said finally. We'll dig, but if we're going to make this public, we'll need more than just financial discrepancies. We'll need personal witnesses, people close to James who are willing to speak out, staff, business partners, anyone who's seen his true colors. The first blow came quietly but decisively. Harold worked late into the night compiling reports and records that painted James as less of a financial genius and more of a reckless opportunist. The documents showed a troubling pattern of offshore accounts, illegal tax evasions, and risky business ventures, all things James had buried deep under layers of fake corporations and loopholes. The leak wasn't flashy. Harold chose a small but respected financial blog with a reputation for uncovering corporate scandals. It was the kind of place that wouldn't hesitate to run the story, even if it meant going up against a powerful figure like James Carrington. 3 days after the blog posted the expose, the cracks started to show. James's name began circulating in financial circles. Anonymous sources whispered about irregularities, and business reporters started to sniff around for confirmation. Investors grew uneasy, and Carrington Enterprises saw its stock dip for the first time in years. It wasn't a plunge. It was subtle, like the first tremor before an earthquake. Grace read the article online, sitting in the corner of Elias's cluttered cottage, her hands wrapped around a steaming mug of tea. Her heart raced as she scrolled through the damning details, but she kept her expression calm. It's not enough to destroy him, Harold had warned her when they planned this first move, but it's enough to make him look over his shoulder, and that's exactly what it did. James sat in his glass-walled office, his jaw tight as he read the article for the third time. His phone buzzed on the desk, the screen lighting up with messages from his PR team and corporate advisors. Everyone wanted a statement, an explanation, damage control. Get me Alex, he barked into the intercom, referring to his head of public relations. The man entered moments later, his face pale with worry. We're working on a response, sir, something vague but reassuring. We're saying the accounts were used for international partnerships, perfectly legal, nothing unusual. Cut the crap, James snapped, tossing the tablet onto the desk. Who leaked this? Alex hesitated. We don't know yet, but we're looking into it. Could be a former employee, someone with a grudge. I don't want guesses, Alex. I want results, James said coldly, his voice dropping into the tone that made his subordinates flinch. This doesn't get out of hand. You understand me? Yes, sir. Alex stammered, retreating from the room as quickly as possible. James leaned back in his chair, staring out at the city skyline. His mind churned with possibilities, but one thought stuck out above the rest. This wasn't random. Someone was coming for him. While James scrambled to protect his public image, Grace and Harold quietly moved to the next phase of their plan, recruiting allies from within James's empire. Grace had lived in the Carrington estate long enough to know that the walls had ears, and now it was time to see if those ears were willing to talk. I'll do it, Grace said, pacing Harold's office as he prepared a list of potential names. No, Harold replied firmly. It's too dangerous. If anyone recognizes you, they won't, Grace interrupted. She gestured to her short, dark hair and the heavy coat she wore. I'm not the woman they remember. I can handle this. Harold hesitated, his lawyerly instincts warring with the determination he saw in Grace's eyes. Finally, he sighed. All right, but be careful. We can't afford afford a misstep. The first name on the list was Maria, a housekeeper who had worked for the Carringtons for years. Grace remembered her as kind but cautious, a woman who kept her head down and rarely spoke unless spoken to. But Grace also remembered the way Maria had looked at her during James's colder moments, like she wanted to say something but didn't dare. Maria worked mornings at a small cafe in the city. A part-time job she'd taken after Robert Carrington's death had reduced her hours at the estate. Grace watched her from across the street, waiting for the right moment to approach. When Maria stepped outside for a break, Grace followed. "Maria," she said quietly, pulling her scarf lower to reveal her face. The older woman froze, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Mrs. Carrington," she whispered. "Not so loud," Grace urged, glancing around. "I'm not supposed to be alive. James doesn't know I survived, and I need to keep it that way for now." Maria's hands trembled as she brought them to her mouth. "We thought you... Oh, God, he told us it was an accident." "It wasn't. He pushed me, Maria, and I need your help to prove it." Maria hesitated, her loyalty to the Carrington name warring with her fear of James and her sympathy for Grace. Finally, she nodded. "What do you need?" With Maria's testimony and Harold's gathered evidence, the next phase began. Anonymously, they fed more information to the media, leaks about James's treatment of staff, whispers of his ruthless control over his wife, and carefully worded hints about the accident that took Grace's life. It was a slow burn, but the stories began to take shape. James was no longer the grieving husband in the eyes of the public. He was a man with secrets, cracks forming in the perfect facade he had built. Back in his office, James stared at the latest headline: Carrington Empire under fire, financial scandals and staff allegations raise questions. His hand tightened around the glass of scotch he held, his knuckles white. This wasn't just bad luck. This was deliberate. Someone was trying to destroy him, and deep down, he had a terrible suspicion about who it might be. The final decision to file a criminal complaint wasn't one they made lightly. It was Harold who spoke the words aloud first. "We have enough," he said, leaning back in his chair. "The offshore accounts, the testimony from the staff, the physical evidence of your injuries from the hospital records, it's all airtight. We can tie him to attempted murder, fraud, and intent to deceive law enforcement. It's time, Grace." Grace stared at the papers in front of her, her fingers brushing over the edge of one of the documents. A small, nervous part of her wanted to hesitate, to wait a little longer, to make the case even stronger. But another part of her, the part that had survived the fall and fought her way back from the edge of death, knew Harold was right. "Once we file this," she said slowly, looking up at him, "there's no going back. He'll know I'm alive." Harold nodded, his expression solemn. "He'll know. But by the time he finds out, the system will already be moving against him. The police, the courts, the media, they'll all be watching. He won't be able to touch you." Grace's jaw tightened. She had come too far to turn back now. "Let's do it," she said. The complaint was filed on a rainy Tuesday morning, the sound of raindrops tapping against the window of Harold's office as they sent the final documents to the district attorney's office. The official charges included: 1. Attempted murder. 2. Fraud and financial crimes. 3. Obstruction of justice. By the time the paperwork hit the prosecutor's desk, it wasn't just a case. It was a storm. Every piece of evidence was meticulously arranged, each detail pointing directly to James. Harold and Grace had timed the filing perfectly, ensuring the media was ready to blow the story wide open the moment the complaint became public record. Within hours of the filing, the headlines hit like a tidal wave. Grace's face, now unmistakable with her cropped black hair and the faint scar on her temple, appeared on screens across the country. Her carefully written statement, released through Harold's office, was as precise as the plan itself. "I trusted James Carrington with my life, and he tried to take it from me. For months I've lived in fear, knowing the man who was supposed to love me pushed me off a cliff and left me for dead. But I refused to stay silent. I survived, and now I'm here to tell the truth. No one, no matter how powerful, should be above the law." The statement was everywhere: news broadcasts, blogs, social media. The public, already uneasy after weeks of financial scandal rumors, turned against James almost instantly. The grieving husband image he had crafted crumbled overnight. It didn't take long for the legal system to act. With the evidence Grace and Harold had provided, the DA's office moved swiftly to issue a warrant for James's arrest. 2 days after the complaint was filed, law enforcement officers arrived at the Carrington estate, their presence drawing the attention of neighbors and reporters alike. James answered the door himself, his jaw tight as the lead officer stepped forward. "James Carrington," the officer said, his tone neutral but firm. "You're under arrest for attempted murder, fraud, and obstruction of justice." The cameras outside the estate captured everything. James being led away in handcuffs, his usually composed expression twisted into a masked fury. The image spread like wildfire, further solidifying the public's perception of him as a dangerous, calculating man who thought he was above the law. From the safety of Harold's office, Grace watched the footage of James's arrest. Her hands were steady as she held the tablet, her heart beating in a calm, measured rhythm. She felt no pity, no hesitation. For the first time in months, she felt free. "This is just the beginning," Harold said, standing beside her. "The trial will be brutal. He's not going to go down without a fight. I know, but I'm not going to stop, not until he pays for everything he's done." The courtroom was electric with anticipation. The trial had gripped the nation for weeks, and now the air was thick with tension as the prosecution prepared to take their final steps. Grace Carrington sat at the prosecution table, poised yet visibly scarred. The faint marks on her temple and the determined set of her jaw told a story of survival that the media had endlessly dissected. Across from her, James Carrington was the picture of controlled arrogance, his sharp suit and calm demeanor hiding the storm beneath. Victor Gray, James's lawyer, opened with his usual charisma. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is not about justice. It's about vengeance. My client has been unjustly accused of heinous acts by a woman driven by resentment and fantasy." He gestured to Grace. "Mrs. Carrington claims she was pushed, but where is the evidence? Where are the witnesses? The truth is, this is a tragic accident being weaponized against a grieving man." Grace tightened her grip on the table, her nails digging into her palm. Harold leaned toward her, his voice steady. "Stay calm, let him overreach. The truth is on our side." Maria, the former housekeeper, was one of the first witnesses called. Her hands trembled as she adjusted her glasses, her gaze flicking nervously to James before settling on Harold. "Maria, how long did you work for the Carrington family?" 15 years, she replied softly. "And in those years, did you observe Mr. Carrington's behavior toward his wife?" Maria hesitated, glancing at Grace, then back at Harold. "He was controlling," she said. "Always wanted things his way. If she disagreed, he'd get angry, but not loud, just cold." Harold nodded. "Thank you, Maria. Now let's talk about the night Mrs. Carrington disappeared. Can you tell the court what you observed?" Maria's voice trembled. "He came home late. His clothes were wet, but he wasn't upset. He told me to clean up and went to bed like nothing had happened." Harold's expression darkened. "And did Mr. Carrington say anything about Mrs. Carrington?" "He said she'd gone missing during a walk, but he didn't seem worried. It was like he already knew." Victor stood for cross-examination, a slick smile on his face. "Maria, isn't it true that you were recently dismissed by Mr. Carrington? That you might hold a grudge against him?" Maria's lips trembled, but her voice was firm. "I'm not here for revenge. I'm here because I know what I saw. He didn't care that she was gone. He wanted her gone." Victor's smirk faded slightly as murmurs rippled through the jury. The courtroom fell silent as Grace took the stand. She adjusted the microphone, her voice steady despite the tension in her shoulders. "Mrs. Carrington," Harold began, "can you tell us about your marriage to Mr. Carrington?" "At first it was perfect," Grace said. "He was everything I thought I wanted. But over time he changed, or maybe I just started to see who he really was. Cold, manipulative, and controlling." Harold nodded. "What happened on the night in question?" Grace took a deep breath. "We were on a trip for our anniversary. He suggested a walk by the cliffs, and I thought he was trying to make amends." Her hands tightened on the edge of the stand as her voice wavered. "But then he started talking about how small we are, how easy it is to disappear, and then he pushed me. He looked me in the eye and pushed me." The jury leaned forward, hanging on her every word. Victor rose for cross-examination. "Mrs. Carrington, you claim my client pushed you, but isn't it true that you and he argued often, that you'd even considered leaving him?" "Yes," Grace admitted. "We argued, and I thought about leaving, but I never thought he'd try to kill me." Victor smirked. "And yet here you are. Isn't it possible that you slipped, and now you're looking for someone to blame?" Grace met his gaze, her voice steel. "No, he wanted me gone, and he almost got away with it." Elias took the stand, his rugged presence a stark contrast to the courtroom's polished atmosphere. He nodded once to Grace before turning to Harold. Elias, Harold said, you rescued Mrs. Carrington. Can you describe her condition? She was half dead, Elias said bluntly. Broken arm, ribs bruised, barely breathing. Looked like she'd fought hell and won. Harold nodded. And did she say anything about what happened? She told me he pushed her, Elias said simply. Didn't sound like a lie to me. Victor stood, his tone condescending. Mr. Elias, you're a fisherman, not a doctor. Are you qualified to assess Mrs. Carrington's injuries? Elias smirked. Don't need to be a doctor to know someone's been through hell. Laughter rippled through the courtroom, and Victor scowled. The tension in the courtroom was palpable. The jury seemed torn, their eyes darting between Grace, Elias, and the ever-composed James Carrington. But Harold Bennett wasn't done. He stood, his movements deliberate, and addressed the judge with a firm voice. Your Honor, the prosecution requests permission to introduce new evidence, Harold said, holding up a sealed envelope. Victor was on his feet in an instant. Objection, Your Honor. This is highly irregular. The prosecution has had ample time to present their case. Introducing evidence now is an ambush tactic designed to mislead the jury. The judge fixed Harold with a sharp look. Mr. Bennett, you've been in my courtroom long enough to know how this works. What exactly is in that envelope? Your Honor, this is the original will and testament of Robert Carrington. Its contents are directly relevant to the defendant's motive and the events that led to this trial. The murmurs in the courtroom swelled into a buzz of speculation. The judge banged her gavel for silence, her gaze flicking between Harold and Victor. Finally, she spoke. Proceed, Mr. Bennett, but tread carefully. Harold handed the envelope to the bailiff, who delivered it to the judge. As she opened it and began to read, her stern expression shifted to one of surprise, then resolve. Mr. Bennett, the judge said, I trust you're prepared to explain why this wasn't submitted earlier. Harold nodded. Yes, Your Honor, the contents of this will are damning, and its late submission was a strategic decision. If we had introduced it prematurely, the defense would have spun it as irrelevant. But with the evidence we've already presented, this document ties everything together. He turned to the jury, his voice carrying an undercurrent of urgency. Ladies and gentlemen, the document you've just seen is the original will of Robert Carrington. It was authenticated by forensic experts and secured after considerable effort. Its contents make one thing abundantly clear. Robert Carrington did not intend for his wealth to go to James Carrington. Instead, he left his entire estate, every dollar, every property, every investment, to his daughter-in-law, Grace Carrington. The revelation hit the courtroom like a bomb. Gasps erupted from the gallery, followed by a wave of whispers that the judge had to quell with her gavel. Harold pressed on, ignoring the tension in the room. This will, ladies and gentlemen, is the key to understanding the defendant's actions. James Carrington knew he was excluded from his father's fortune. He knew the power and wealth he had relied on his entire life were gone. And when he discovered that Grace was the sole beneficiary, he forged a new will to take it all for himself. He gestured toward James, his voice rising with conviction. But even that wasn't enough for him. When Grace began to see through his lies, he realized she was a threat, and that's why he pushed her off that cliff, because her survival would expose everything. The jury's attention was riveted, their earlier doubts fading as Harold connected the dots with precision and passion. Grace's mind reeled as Harold's words echoed in the courtroom. Robert Carrington had left everything to her. Her, the woman James had always dismissed, undermined, and belittled. Her eyes widened, searching Harold's face for some sign of a mistake, but his expression was resolute. Then she turned to James, her chest tightening with a mix of disbelief and betrayal. You knew, she whispered under her breath, her voice barely audible but heavy with shock. I thought you loved me. James's lips moved, as though he wanted to say something, but no words came out. Instead, he clenched his fists, his eyes narrowing. His silence said everything. Grace's disbelief gave way to something quieter but more resolute, clarity. The man she had once trusted, once loved, had orchestrated every moment of their life together for his gain, and now, finally, his lies were unraveling in front of the world. Victor stood, his voice uncharacteristically strained. Your Honor, the defense would like like to request a recess to examine this new evidence. Harold shot back immediately. Your Honor, the defense has had every opportunity to address this. The will has been authenticated and verified. The jury deserves to hear the truth without further delay. The judge didn't hesitate. Request denied. The trial will proceed. Unable to contain himself any longer, James shot to his feet. This is absurd, he shouted, his voice echoing in the stunned silence of the courtroom. The judge banged her gavel. Mr. Carrington, sit down or I will hold you in contempt. But James ignored her, his anger boiling over. That money was mine. My father was senile when he wrote that will. He didn't know what he was doing. Grace doesn't deserve a cent. Grace stared at him, her expression calm but unyielding. The jury's faces reflected shock and disgust as they took in James's outburst. Mr. Carrington, the judge thundered, this behavior is unacceptable. Sit down now. James's lawyer tugged at his arm, hissing for him to stop, but James wrenched free, pointing a finger at Grace. You think you've won? You're nothing without me. The courtroom erupted, the noise deafening. The judge's gavel pounded repeatedly, her voice rising above the chaos. Order! Order in the court! As James was finally subdued, the courtroom settled into an uneasy quiet. Harold turned back to the jury, his voice calm and deliberate. Ladies and gentlemen, you've seen the truth with your own eyes. James Carrington's actions, his forgery, his greed, and now his outburst confirm what we've been saying all along. He is guilty of attempted murder and fraud. The judge addressed the jury with a firm voice. You've heard the evidence, you've seen the testimonies. It is now your duty to deliberate and deliver justice. The jury returned quickly. The foreperson stood, her voice steady. In the matter of attempted murder, we find the defendant, James Carrington, guilty. The judge's voice was firm as she addressed James. Mr. Carrington, your greed and actions have brought you here. You are sentenced to 30 years in prison without parole. Take him away. The courthouse steps were buzzing with reporters, their cameras flashing as Grace emerged, flanked by Harold and a handful of supporters. The wind tugged at her hair, but her steps were steady, her chin held high. She had faced her past, and now she was walking toward her future. She paused at the bottom of the steps, looking at Harold. I still don't understand why Robert would leave everything to me, she said softly. Harold smiled faintly. Because he saw something in you that James never could. Integrity, strength, compassion. He trusted you to honor his legacy in a way his son never would. Grace nodded, the weight of the responsibility settling over her shoulders. I won't let him down, she said quietly. A week later, Grace found herself on a familiar stretch of cliffs, the wind carrying the scent of salt and brine. Elias's small weathered cottage came into view, and she smiled as he stepped out onto the porch, wiping his hands on a rag. Didn't think I'd be seeing you again so soon, Elias said, his gruff voice carrying a hint of surprise. Grace stepped forward, holding out an envelope. You saved my life, Elias. I wouldn't be here if it weren't for you. Elias raised an eyebrow, taking the envelope cautiously. He opened it, his weathered hands revealing a check with an amount that made his eyes widen. What's this? A fresh start, Grace said simply. You've given so much to help others, Elias. Now it's time for someone to help you. Use it to fix up the cottage, get a new boat, whatever you need. Elias stared at the check, then back at her, his expression softening. You didn't have to do this. I did, Grace said firmly, because if there's one thing I've learned through all of this, it's that the people who truly care deserve the world, and you've given me more than I could ever repay. Elias nodded, a rare smile breaking through his usually stoic demeanor.